sensitive these days.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this regular meeting of the Budget and Finance Committee. Today is Monday, February 4th, 2013. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chair of the committee. I'm joined by Council members Mitch Englander and Bill Rosendahl, and we're ready to begin. We'll be taking general public comment as the first item today. But if you would like to offer comment either on any agenda item or any matter within the jurisdiction of this committee, please fill out a card and bring it forward. Right now I only have one card for general public comment, and that is Jay Handel. So I'm going to ask Mr. Handel to come forward and offer his comments now.
Good afternoon. My name is Jay Handel. I'm the chair of the Neighborhood Council Budget Advocates. I'm here before you today to give you some updates. First of all, for everybody out there, they should know that the budget survey is now live. It is at la.budgetchallenge.org, and we would ask everybody in the city to take it. The more information we have, the better information we can give to our electeds as to what the city feels they need and what they really want to have in their individual communities. Secondly, I'm here today because, just to give you an update, our committee of 36 this year is working very diligently, working with department heads, union leaders, alliances around the city to really dig in and find out what's happening with our budget. As you know, in the last 2 years, we've written white papers. We believe the Inspector General has picked up a number of items, I believe 22 from our last white paper, that makes us believe that we're actually being heard and that we have some credibility in what we're doing in the city, but we need to do more, as you need to do more. It's become pretty evident that the structural deficit continues to get worse. It doesn't go away, and now we're talking about a sales tax to try and fill a hole that's just a hole that will be filled, that will be another hole next year. And I guess the question from the budget advocates to the 3 members here today and to all 15 members, or 14 that are still here, is assuming that the sales tax fails, what's the real plan? Because running around telling everybody in the city, we're going to cut public safety, you know, the police have to go, we're going to cut the police, doesn't make it any better trying to make this a more friendly city for people to come and do business in and to live in. And that being the case, that kind of scare tactic really doesn't work to our advantage. So my question with my last 4 seconds, and I'll come back again, is what's the real plan? Thank you.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, Mr. Handel, that the cuts that will be necessary if Measure A doesn't pass are not going to make the city any more business friendly. I certainly agree with you on that. I want to thank you and the budget advocates for the work that you're doing. I'll ask that you again offer your report before the City Council as we have in the past.
Mr. Chair, if I just might make a comment since he's from my district, just a hello to him.
Sure.
I want to say, Jay, I've admired your leadership over the years. You've been a terrific advocate for the community, a grassroots true leader, and we obviously look forward to working with you. But I'll be candid, that half-cent sales tax, I want it passed. Thank you.
Thank you. I also appreciate the input that the neighborhood advocates have provided, as you mentioned, some of which have been taken up by the Inspector General, and the Inspector General's report will be brought before this committee within the next couple of weeks as well. As far as the real plan, the FSRs that we'll be hearing, the FSR that we'll be hearing shortly, will be giving a bit of an outline, I think, of the impacts, the drastic impacts that will be coming to this city if Measure A does not pass, when we have to try to remedy that $200 million deficit that we're facing in the coming year, and the $300 million deficit the year after that if there is not a Measure A in place. So we'll certainly be touching on that in the FSR, and I think that will be a hint of things to come. I can assure you that they're not scare tactics. It's the reality of dollars and cents. Now, we will move on to, that closes public comment. That was the only public comment card that I have. Thank you, Mr. Handel. I'd like to now offer the opportunity for public comment on any of our closed session items 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. As of now, I've received no cards, and I don't see anybody waving their hands. So public comment on the closed session items is now closed, and we will begin with item 1 in closed session. So if you're not here on the closed session items, I'd ask that you step out until we can resume an open session. Okay, thanks.
All right. Ready for
Welcome
item
back,
number 6?
everyone. That brings us to item number 6.
Item number 6 is CAO report relative to communications with credit rating agencies. Natalie Brill is here from our office to provide the report.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Beginning of January, we met with the rating agencies really for the solid waste program, which is being sold on February 12th. But also at the same time, Fitch had decided that they wanted to meet with us about the general budget, and Moody's was in the process of looking at our general obligation bond funding. What Moody's did was they upgraded us on the general obligation bonds. In the past, we always considered our general obligation bonds our general credit, and we always compared ourselves to other cities using general obligation bonds. Moody's kind of changed the paradigm on us. They're looking at general obligation bonds now more as an assessment type bond, where it's separated out from the general fund, where they're basically saying, we're looking at your property tax, your collection rate, the value of your properties, and that's how we're going to rate you. However, they did not upgrade our general fund debt at all. So now there's a bigger gap between the rating for our general obligation bonds and our general fund debt. What does that mean?
Tell us.
If you're asking me, I think it means that they are basically telling us that your general fund is not as strong as your property tax and your general obligation bonds, those bonds that are secured by something else besides your general fund. That message has never been so clear to us. Fitch and S&P have not made that distinction yet. But so if you were to ask me what our general fund credit looked like, instead of going to the general obligation bonds, I would now go like to a MICLA, and I would tell you, it's a A+ or it's a AA-. It's no longer like a general obligation bond, which is a straight AA. So what Moody's is basically telling us is that we're closer to the A category in our general fund debt than we are to the AA category. And that's, it might be all semantics to everybody, but that's a really bold distinction that they're making. Because in the past, when they upgraded general obligation bonds, they upgraded the general fund at the same time. So the difference between the two was slight. Now it's bigger. It's like 3 to 4 notches between the two. Whereas the other rating agencies have kept us pretty close. What that means is that it'll cost us more to issue debt on the general fund side. We don't know. When we go out for MICLA later on in this calendar year, we'll have a better sense.
Wait, I'm sorry, just to clarify that point. It will not cost us more. It will cost us more relative to the other secured debt.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Because
So
there has not been a downgrade. There hasn't been a change.
There has not been a
That
downgrade.
will cause an increase in our debt costs.
Yes, because they did not increase us like they did the general obligation
Right.
bonds. Now, having said that, because there's very little in the market right now, and because, people like the city of LA, and they know that we're a big budget, we're a big city, the chances of us not paying our debt are very low, that we pay our debt, we balance our budget every year. Those are all things that go into what investors look at. It's not just about the rating anymore. After 2008, it became clear that it's not just about the rating. There's a lot of other things. So, it's hard to tell what exactly investors will look at when they see that large differential. I mean, it's really, it's always about the market. If the market wants our bonds on that particular day, then we'll do well. If there's not a lot of competition that day, or there's not a lot of money in the market, it'll cost us more. It really becomes, I think, more market-driven than it has before. So, solid waste stayed the same. We go out February 12th. It is a competitive deal versus a negotiated, and we'll see. Solid waste is a fee-supported revenue bond, so we'll see how we do with that. We expect it to do well. We expect it to do like wastewater does. So we'll have to wait and see. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Just curious.
Sure.
Obviously, we care about the general fund, we care about services, we care about additional costs for anything in this moment in time. Do you have any speculative thought in your mind of what this might cost the general fund or might impact us within this context?
No, because last time we went out with the MICLA, we did really well. We didn't even hit 4%, so it's hard for me to say in the future what will happen. A lot of things are happening in the market. The sequestration, is a big deal right now in the market. There's the whole issue of, will tax-exempt bonds still be tax-exempt bonds?
Yep.
Will there be a cap? All that seems to be playing in, so, we're not quite sure how all that's going to affect our bond issue. We had set to sell solid waste before we thought all these issues would be solved by January 1st. Obviously they haven't, so we'll see what happens February 12th. If we don't like what we see, we can always pull out of the market.
You said February 12th?
Oh yeah, we're selling February 12th. If we don't like what we see in the market, we have no obligation to move forward. We can always reject all bids and wait till the market calms down and go out again once the federal government has put their house in order. Because that's what the issue right now. It's not even to do with us. It's all about the feds. And you see that in the stock market. They're not sure which way to go, up or down, and that affects our bonds, so.
Well, and that's actually an important point, because between now and 30 days or so from now, Congress is going to continue to debate the remaining issues relating to the fiscal cliff resolution. One of the arguments that has been presented by some is to eliminate the tax exemption on municipal bonds. So have the rating agencies arbitraged that? I mean, if you're looking at a bond that's going to go out in February, we might delay it until March or April. I mean, that could be a very significant difference depending on what Congress does. So has Moody's or Fitch or anybody taken that risk element into account?
The Government Finance Officers Association did their Washington office did an analysis, and they thought that if there was a cap of 28% on tax exempt, so your cap is 28%. You can't claim any other exemption. That it could be between 50 and 75 basis points. Again, there's not a lot in the market right now. So there's a lot of money, though, out there looking to be placed somewhere. So the question is, how much will that affect our bonds? How much will sequestration and the fiscal cliff and the tax exemption affect us when we go to the market? Is there such an appetite for municipal bonds anyway that they'd take the chance and buy it? My opinion is, you see what happens February 12th. You see where we are. If we don't like the numbers, then we reject all bids and we wait a month. But at this point in time, it's really hard. People are selling. The municipal market is still continuing. So, and people are getting good rates. So it's hard to tell exactly. And it's solid waste. It's a revenue bond. So it's hard to predict what's going to happen. But that's, my opinion is you move forward and you see what happens. I don't see a point at this right now to postpone. If I do, I'll come back to you and I'll tell you.
Whatever that appetite for municipal bonds may be, it's going to be a lot less if they're not tax deductible. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
I would hope that people take the opportunity to let members of Congress know that that particular solution will be directly at the expense of municipal governments across the country.
Yeah, well, there's several of us going to Washington in the next few weeks, I know, and that's been discussed. I myself am going to GFOA tomorrow, and we're meeting with the Securities and Exchange Commission staff members and with the Municipal Regulation Board staff members, and one of the committee members, the one I think that does, what is it, appropriations or finance, are coming to speak to the municipal market. And it's not just us, the underwriters and the banks, they're all lobbying also. This is not just about the wealthy, this is about the taxpayers paying more for their infrastructure. And that's a message that we've been trying to let everybody know. And the GFOA, the League of Cities, the League of Mayors, they all have prepared papers on that. And we've been just monitoring that. You know, the city passed a resolution on December 14th, opposing the cap. So, we've done everything we can. All we have to do is make sure that those lawmakers that are going to vote understand this is not about a tax break for the wealthy. This really trickles down to the taxpayers.
Hear, hear. Mr. Kretz.
Yeah, I'm surprised to see that we have a projection of $2.6 million less from the DWP. What's that based on? What's the cause of that?
Oh, I think that was the difference, right? Yeah.
Oh, does this have to do with the power revenue transfer for the
Yeah.
current
Yes,
year?
yes.
Okay, so that, we'll talk about it in the upcoming FSR, but it's basically, the transfer is based on prior year net receipts with some criteria, and basically their net receipts were down slightly from what was projected back when the budget was put together.
So is that because we're using fewer resources as a city? What's the reason?
It basically, as they close their books, when they provide initial number, they quite haven't finished and closed out the fiscal year. So now their fiscal year is closed out as of June 30th. That transfer is based on actually their net revenue, and so their net revenue was down slightly from last year.
So it's just basically the formula applied when it's initially a guesstimate. And
Yes, basically it's a projection on what their net revenue will be when the number is provided. Now they've actually closed the books, net revenue was down just slightly.
Okay, and also, just about bonds in general, we seem to have this constant give and take with the rating agencies.
Yeah.
Now that we seem to be heading in a somewhat positive direction, how do you feel about the future in terms of what kind of ratings we get, and are they actually paying attention to the positive things and all the steps we've taken in the last few years?
Well, I think as we indicate in our, fourth paragraph, some of the language that was used by Moody's states, despite significant general fund budget cuts in recent years, the city continues to have a substantial structural deficit. That is what they're still looking at. As we look in our out years, we still have a deficit. They would like to have us basically eliminate that structural deficit, and that's what they're really looking at.
So are we getting credit for the fact that we lopped off millions of dollars off that structural deficit?
Yeah, they mentioned.
Or do they just ignore that till we get to zero?
They are certainly taking recognition, of what we've done, because they acknowledge we have come a long ways. I mean, we have made a number of changes over the years that really have brought down that deficit. They're just concerned about the remaining piece. And as you know, sometimes as you get closer to what you have, sort of that remaining gap, it gets harder to address that remaining piece. And that's what they're referencing.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why we stayed the same in the general fund. That's my indication from talking to them, is that we did make gains. So they didn't put us on negative watch. They didn't do anything like that. They kept us the same because they're waiting to see what happens, especially with the election coming up. And, there's a lot of change going on. They want to see what happens when all the dust settles. The city's still committed as a city to good financial management, to making the cuts they need to make. Fitch was the most concerned about that, actually. They asked directly what will happen July 1st. Well, we'll continue as a city with a new mayor and 7 new council members and a new controller and, older new city attorney, I mean, we were honest with them, but that's, the political reality of the city, so.
I mean, I think there'll obviously be a lot of change in the players just because there's so many open seats and open elections, but I don't imagine the city will do anything differently other than continue to pass balanced budgets and get through this. So I don't know exactly what they're expecting.
Well, they just upgraded the state of California because they liked what Brown was doing. So that actually helps us because, we can now say that we're not the worst state in the union anymore. We're the next to the last worst state in the union. So, I mean, I'm being facetious, but what California does affect what we do, and we've always tried to distance ourselves from California. We're better managed, we're better.
Yeah, I would hope that California's significant step in the right direction will rub off
It'll
on
help
us a
us.
little bit.
Yeah, it'll help us.
Mr. Englander.
Just wanted to thank you for that update. I mean, if you actually read all the reports, they're interesting. And while there are some positive comments in here, there's still a lot of concern by the credit rating agencies here as well. And by the way, they did mention the July 1st thing. I saw that in Fitch is asking if we're actually going to keep our CAO. I guess the CAO was one to respond to these, so that was it would have been fun to be a fly on the wall when he was retyping that. But in any event, it was also wanted to ask about they really didn't address the 1% for the infrastructure policy. It was brought up, but is that anticipated? It wasn't answered. It was anticipated to be in the 13-14 budget. Do we know yet?
Well, I think they acknowledge that the city has been struggling and trying to fund its infrastructure, and because we've, for the most part, suspended that as a policy for a good 4 or 5 years, they acknowledge that. But certainly, for us to sort of even, one of the criteria for us, I imagine for us getting an upgrade would actually being able to fund some of that infrastructure, getting that 1% back in there.
And then it was noted in here, it said that all the departments that were fee supported are actually now fully cost recovery. But things like Bureau of Sanitation is being funded out of the general fund for the SPA reimbursements and settlements. And so have we done an analysis of that independently?
I think what they were referring to were like the fee supported, not necessarily like the larger spa, but sort of like a fee or permit where we continuously do through the budget process. We ask departments, hey, you have a particular fee. Have you done your fee analysis? Make sure you're achieving full cost recovery. So we go through that every year. There are a handful, such as SPA, the stormwater, where we know the general fund is certainly subsidizing that program.
Does that take into account the actual cash basis of what's billed and collected? Or is that just take into account what's billed and the appropriate fees being associated with that service?
Well, when we do the fee for service, it's actually supposed to be on actual costs, both actual receipts and actual costs.
And
Yes.
so it's showing that we're
Reconcile it, yes.
doing a better job on those? Okay. And then just a couple other points. One of the points I didn't realize until actually reading the report was on page 5, where it actually talks about they asked about the new revenue growth initiatives underway, and the response from the city was based on the March half-cent sales tax, but it suggested that only $105 million, or roughly 50% of that, would be realized in fiscal years 13-14. It's only half of, which would still leave us with on or around $100 million deficit with that. I don't know that. I didn't realize it until I had read it in here in the report. Is that because of an implementation?
Yes. Basically, if we have the election on March 5th, there's a 20-day certification process, in which case then you have to sort of adopt by resolution. There's also then a in-state code in the tax and revenue code section. Once council adopts a resolution, there's a 110-day period. And then once that 110-day period ends, then we can implement on the first quarter date of the calendar. So meaning we missed July 1st, so then it goes into effect October 1st. By the time we collect the revenue, it won't be until January.
I see. Okay.
Right, because it's 3 months lag in sales tax.
There's a lag.
Anything further?
Just interested in February 12th, obviously. Good luck.
Thank you. I'm glad I'm not the only one that finds these reports interesting.
Well, it is, and
It
thank
is.
you for it. I mean, it's interesting on many levels. First, it does indicate, I think, it's an affirmation of the progress that the city has made so far, while at the same time, it's a sober and realistic look at the challenges that we continue to face. It's an acknowledgement of how difficult it's going to be to close a $500 million deficit over the next 2 years. And I think if you look at the report and look at the questions that are asked by the rating agencies and the level of detail
Oh, yes.
that they scrub our budget
They
with,
do.
and the level of, nuance in the questions that these rating agencies ask, it tells us, number one, how vulnerable we are to changes in our ratings if we aren't continuing to make complete progress. But I think it also is a kind of a rejection of the statements that many out there would make that the city is somehow papering over its imminent collapse. That I think the people who make their living out of evaluating municipal government's creditworthiness disagree with those naysayers out there who would say that we're teetering on collapse. So I think that's an important point to remember too.
And there's
There's
also-
positive, there's negative, and that's the reality of the situation that we're in right now.
And there's a whole bunch of other credit analysts from all the investment firms now, Vanguard, Franklin, all the big funds, they all do the same thing on their own now. So it's not just the credit agencies, it's also the investors themselves that are looking at us. So,
Very good. Thank you very much. We have one card on item number 6. Mr. Handel, come on up.
Hi, Jay Handel, Chair of the Budget Advocates. Just a couple of things. Number one, the sales tax implementation policy, we knew that when you guys put it out to get it on the ballot. I'm really surprised that there's some people up here that didn't know that. That's pretty scary, because you guys are running our budget and trying to figure out how the hole is going to be filled by not even knowing when the money is going to be coming into us. So that's pretty scary from a budget point of view. And quite frankly, hearing what I heard here, what do they want us to do? They're not going to give us credit for what we did? What do they want us to do? Fix the whole thing? Heck yeah! That's what they want you to do, is fix the budget. That's what we want you to do, is fix the budget. Because we want our trees trimmed. We want our potholes filled. We want our cops to respond. We want our paramedics on time. We want our departments fully funded. We don't want draconian cuts to some departments like you guys have done to them. So yes, council members, we want you to fix the structural deficit, and I think what Moody's is looking for and what everybody else is looking for is for 15 council members to make the tough decisions. You've made some real good decisions, but you haven't gotten down to the tough ones yet. The low-hanging fruit is gone, and now it's time to get down and dirty on the tough decisions. That's what they're looking for. That's what the investors are looking for. That's what the people who elected you are looking for. Fix our city. Fix the budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Handel. Gosh, fix the budget. Why didn't I think of that?
Brilliant.
All right. That brings us to item number 7.
So the recommendation would be the note and file, item 6.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Thanks, now.
Without objection, that'll be the action of the committee.
Okay. That takes us to the last item number 7, which is a SAO report relative to recommendations regarding prior year encumbrances and a proposed general fund encumbrance policy. Would you like to take public comment first if you receive some, or we can go ahead and get
We have
started?
one card on item number 7. Why don't we go ahead and take that now? Mr. Ted Rohrlich?
Actually, Chairman, Mr. Rowley just spoke for the coalition. Would you like to speak after?
Okay, that'd be fine. That'll be fine.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. We also had a little PowerPoint presentation handout just for everyone, and I believe we do have some extra copies. So, as you know, this conversation started several months ago in this committee And it was expressed by several parties for the city, I should say, to establish a formal encumbrance policy. The city it currently doesn't have sort of a formal policy right now. Encumbrances can be carried in our system for many years. If you were to look at some of the data in our report, you'll see things going back to 2000. And so certainly one of the things that we thought would be important for us, for the city to actually establish a formal encumbrance policy. We have a number of financial policies that have been adopted over the last several years, starting in 2005, and this would be, I think, a good one for the city to take a look at, analyze, and perhaps adopt as well. To begin the process, we actually sat down, we formed a working group with SEIU. This is one of the items that they brought to the committee's attention. They want something they want us to look at, because the city has been covering or carrying encumbrances for a number of years. So we sat down with them, formed a working group, and we've had several meetings over the last several months with them. And certainly based on their review and having the conversation with them, what we are presenting today is a formal policy for your review and adoption. If you go to this base slide 2 in the presentation, the report, we're asking for two things, two recommendations. One, as I just mentioned, that we do adopt a formal policy. We're looking to certainly increase transparency and accountability for the city and for the city departments. We do not feel it's appropriate for encumbrances just to be carried in the system year after year after year. We also want to move to an automated process. Currently, the CAO will do review during the year. Doing that review during the year does take some work both on departments and the controller. And so with adoption of the policy, we would recommend that we actually ask the controller and GST to actually automate this process at year end going forward. The second recommendation in the report is for departments to go ahead and disencumber prior year encumbrances of up to $18 million in general fund and another 9.6 in special funds. And we would ask that for consideration the money be set aside in the budget stabilization fund to mitigate service reductions in 13-14. So the basic tenets of the policy in the next page is departments will be allowed to keep the encumbrances for 1 year after the fiscal year closes, whereas right now there is no limitation. They can be kept for a long time. The disencumbrance policy process will be automated, so no more manual process through the year. We just want to automate it at year end, at close. We will also introduce a reappropriation process where departments can request CAO review, council will review those requests in August after year-end close. This would be for potential if there's a liability or a contract, something that does have to get paid. When it gets canceled, we can go ahead and do a reappropriation report where that money will be reappropriated into current year funds. We are recommending that we exempt capital projects simply because of their ongoing nature. Many times we have to build up funding for a particular project. There are many of those projects across the city, so we think it would be appropriate for us to exempt capital projects. And certainly we're recommending a phase-in schedule for departments over the next couple of years. Okay. As you can see, the next slide just sort of gives you just how the phase-in will work. We have February 13 of the current month, where we're looking at 2010, 11, and older. Come around with adoption of policy June 2014 at the end of the year. Prior year encumbrances from 11-12 and 12-13 would be disencumbered. And then last year, the phase in June 2015, 13-14 would be disencumbered. As I mentioned, the general fund savings at the totals is over $18 million. But if you look at it strictly from a policy standpoint of what we are recommending, the general fund savings from this first year would be about $15.3 million. We have additional general fund monies because departments are saying that there are some encumbrances in 11-12 that can be released at $2.9 million. Okay. Next slide just sort of gives you just a little illustration. And actually, once you go ahead and turn to the last slide, it's sort of after the phase, and it gives you a sense that basically at the beginning of the fiscal year, in this example, it's July 1st, 2015, there's an initial appropriation, whatever that might be. Departments have 1 year to spend that appropriation. After the close, if they've encumbered money, departments have another full year in order to basically pay whatever outstanding bills they have against that encumbrance, and then those encumbrances would be automatically disencumbered. So the cycle is basically for a total of 2 years that departments would have funding. Okay.
And this is Ben Sale with the CEO. Just to add to that, as mentioned in that brief report, the cycle would really come into play 2 years from now because we want a phase-in approach. We thought it was going to be tough for some of the departments to give up some of those encumbrances, especially those from 11-12, which was just 2 fiscal years ago or last fiscal year. So we felt it necessary to phase in this approach. In doing so, we've identified that $18.2 million that can go to the general fund if that policy is applied. And one final note is these are one-time funds, meaning that once we sweep these funds into the reserve fund or the budget stabilization funds, those funds are gone. And any future encumbrances that are disencumbered will be from future years and also on a one-time basis.
Now, we realize departments are going to be concerned. They're going to be concerned that we have some money that we need to hang on to for whatever purpose. As I mentioned earlier, we are recommending basically what I'm going to call a reappropriation process, where departments can, after the fiscal year end closes and the controllers close the books, then departments can request, hey, I need this money back for this particular contract or liability, and then we will report back to council with recommendations.
Well, and likewise, I would assume that once a policy like this is adopted, there would be a management imperative to project forward and to disclose to the committee future plans for encumbered funds so that we can all kind of be on the same page as to what those encumbered funds are eventually going to be spent for and when, and we can maintain some accountability of ensuring that those expenditures are on track, which hasn't always been the case. So
that is true.
I think this is an important step forward. And Mr. Sad, did you have anything else that you wanted to present?
Yes, just in terms of the recommendations, we know we have some dates in the recommendations with respect to when some of these funds would be disencumbered and when when the funds would revert to the reserve fund. Just to note that it's our intent to proceed with those dates, but for those encumbrances that fall within the policy and for whatever reason, technical or otherwise, we're unable to disencumber by those dates or sweep to the reserve fund by the March 15th date, our backup will be the year-end close. So whether for technical reasons, if they can't get through on this proposed schedule, for those that are being recommended for disencumbrance, we will catch those through the year-end process.
If I may just add, part of that cautionary note from Ben is one of the struggles we've had with the disencumbrance portion of this. FMS is fairly straightforward. SMS has proven to be a little bit more challenging. GSD over the last several months has put in a lot of time and effort in trying to allow us through this exercise to disencumber a lot of those old encumbrances that have been in SMS, and I think they perhaps are concerned trying to get this all done within the time frame that we provide in the report. It's just giving them a little bit of pause. And I see GSD shaking their head in the back. Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Roosevelt.
Yeah, first of all, I just want to thank the SEIU for making this proposal and putting it together and sitting there with the CAO and the CLA and doing some creative thinking out of the box. So hats off to your organization. Saying that, we need to obviously know, besides the 27 million, which we're grateful for that, do you have a list of all the projects that are to be included, affected by the disencumbering? We have a list?
We can provide a detailed list. Now, we are exempting capital projects.
Right, I know.
So those then will not be affected by this policy. We can provide you with.
Okay, and then the second question, the attachment one lists the council as a department. What projects will be affected that are in this category? Do you have a list of the projects divided by council office?
We can provide a detail with all of the, basically, encumbrances behind it. We've had discussion with folks on the encumbrances here, and certainly we'll work with the parties to resolve whatever concerns they have.
Great. Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
First of all, I echo Mr. Rosenthal's commendations for our partners in labor having done so much to help work this out. I know there was a working group. Was there consensus on everything between that working group, or are there still outstanding issues that need to be worked out?
No, there wasn't consensus on every point that either part of the working group was making, but we did come to, I believe, some mutual agreement with respect to some of the policy recommendations being made. In our report, we indicate that there were basically 4 rules that the SCIU members that were part of the working group wanted us to proceed with. One was to, in essence, do what we're doing now with the time guidelines with respect to encumbrances. So encumbrances that are stale, in other words, so anything more than 24 months should automatically be disencumbered. They also identified in their review many encumbrances that had no vendor name attached to it, which to us means that either there was a technical issue when that encumbrance moved over from our old FMIS unit to FMS, or for whatever reason departments have been carrying encumbrances with no specific vendor name, which also should be disencumbered. So we agreed with those 2 rules. We also agreed with the rule with respect to really small dollar amounts, in some instances cents, that were still encumbered. You may ask, well, why is that the case? Well, sometimes, encumbrances are made for whole dollars, but when we get a bill from a vendor, there could be, half a cent less than what the encumbrance was for. And so those encumbrances get left in, over time, they're still there. We also, if you recall, there was a 10% reduction exercise with respect to contracts that we initiated a couple years back at the direction of, I believe it was you, Mr. Koretz. And so in some instances, those encumbrances were left with, probably 10% or some percent less than what was actually paid out. So there was a number of reasons why some encumbrances were left with some dollars, and in some instances those are nominal amounts, and so those will also be picked up through this encumbrance policy. The one area where we did not agree was more in regards to the recurring nature of some encumbrances, and also how fast we should phase this in. We recommended the phase-in approach that you see in that, anything that's 10, 11, and older would be disencumbered as of February. And then from there on out, 11, 12, and 12, 13 in June of 2014. And after that, we began the more automatic annual phase out. But they the representatives had expressed a desire to move a lot quicker on that regard, and having encumbrances be disencumbered a lot sooner every fiscal year.
Why couldn't we take that approach? What would be the downside to moving that more quickly?
I mean, I think there's a couple different issues. One is the complexity of some of the issues that have been mentioned with SMS. The other thing is workload for departments. Having to undertake a review of encumbrances that have been there for just the prior year, perhaps, and in essence, it's a workload for the departments and also for the controller, having to, as we're starting the fiscal year, you have a new appropriation but at the same time, you would have to then start reviewing the encumbrances from the year that just passed. In some instances, those encumbrances were just made that past June. But because they're encumbered in that prior fiscal year, doing something sooner would already move departments to try to unencumber those funds that, again, were just encumbered that prior month perhaps. So, I mean, it was a workload issue that we saw for the departments, but more so for the controller's office in terms of going through an early reversion exercise, if you will, and then having to do that again at the year end.
I think one of my concerns, or our concerns, we have a number of bills that sort of, or invoices that the city receives in June, but essentially June, the systems get shut down in sort of preparation for the following year. And so there needs to be a process for departments to, when they receive those invoices, for them to make those payments. Once the system is sort of up and running again in July or August, this is everything from, copier, ongoing copier invoices, could even be an invoice that GSD receives from water and power, for water and electricity. So it's things of that sort. It's sort of a balancing on knowing that we're going to have this recurring expenditures that we need to get taken care of. If you cancel everything, it's going to create a whole bunch of work, as Ben mentioned, to go ahead and reappropriate all that money to pay for those invoices. And if you don't, then it's going to create shortfalls in that current fiscal year.
Thank you. Mr. Englander.
Yeah, just a couple of things. One, I wanted to thank the working group and particularly SAU for coming forward on this. It was stated, I remember during the budget deliberations, that there's loose change in the couch. I think was the statement that was made. And if you start looking at some of these reports in detail, there's no question some of these where you go back 5 or 6 or 7 years, it's ridiculous that the money is still sitting there, encumbered for services never rendered, for products or goods never purchased. And that's just sitting there, which is ridiculous. And so for them to bring, and everybody to bring a light to this and saying, why is that money still there? It needs to be, before we cut services, before we cut additional staff, before we start talking about eliminating programs to residents and businesses that the city offers, we've got to look at our own seat cushions. I think it was a good analogy. And so I applaud you on that. The devil's in the details, and I don't have a lot of concern or question. I have some questions about what is it that we are actually unencovering, if you will. And so I actually did read the 1,000-page report. And so I'm looking at these, and there's some of these that they're no-brainers. I mean, there's obvious ones here that if we set aside money internally from one department to another, that's also encumbered, so that's going to free it up. It's just dollars and sitting there. But there's some in here that I have questions about. One on, you mentioned before I get into that, the report itself was apparently supposed to be broken down by department, and every single report is under the Department of Aging, or maybe that's just because...
That was just a template.
All the money is aging.
Yes, no, that was just, when we create these templates, we always start with one department, and aging is always at the front, so.
I figured as much. Hey now. All right. So with that, though, a couple of my observations. One, it's got a section here that talks to the amounts to remain committed. So in other words, what wouldn't be unencumbered. And every one of these sections here on the report is blank. And so it doesn't, and then there's justification why that would remain committed. And every one of the justifications is also blank. In going further in my observation on the capital projects, nothing's actually flagged. There's no field for capital projects. And so I found an example, just looking through it. Specifically, I targeted one that I know with certainty is a capital project, and it's not listed as that, and it's slated for disencumbrance.
What I need to make sure is understood is what you're looking at was actually the data query of all of the encumbrances in FMS and SMS that we were looking at. that does not necessarily say that those specific ones will be the ones to be unencumbered.
So the question is, how do we get a report of the ones that are going to be?
The ones that will be unencumbered, well, in essence, by implementing the policy we're proposing, anything older than 1011 will be disencumbered. It doesn't matter if it was a department said, hey, I need this, or hey, can I keep this?
I get it. That makes sense. It just leads me to another question. Like, if we owe money, to example, the County of Los Angeles or to the South Coast Air Quality Management District or the Board of Equalization from prior years, and the money was set aside to ensure we're not getting fines or penalties or other assessments when we unencumber, is there anybody that's gone back and audited just to ensure that the money we set aside for their bill, that this was left over, the bill was never paid or never received?
Well, I think, again, if it's 1011, then, really the onus should have been on the department to make sure that those bills would have been paid.
And here's my concern. While the onus might have been on the department and we sweep those funds, ultimately the onus is back to this committee and to the full council when we get a bill from one of these agencies or a vendor. We just had a case where we had one where the money was set aside, but the vendor had never paid us on a settlement that it was in closed session, so I can't speak that much of it, last week, and it cost us millions of dollars, and then we engaged with that vendor. We got a great deal moving forward for future work, but that was a case of not paying a vendor bill. So the question becomes, I think the details are critically important. There's a lot in here that there's no question, and I'm sure it's probably close to, if not more than what you're suggesting, go back into the general fund and save those services. I don't dispute that whatsoever, and I think having a policy is critically important. How we get there and getting the proper information and reports either to the departments.
The departments had that information, and they were given the opportunity to review. If I could just make a couple statements here before you
that
ask
statement was made,
question.
and I agree. They were given the opportunity to review, but so the question is, have they done it?
And they did do a review. If you look at the actual report on page 8 of 8, what the departments identified for disencumbrance totaled about $12 million, $7 million of which was general fund dollars. By applying the policy that we've stated, where it basically is a blanket, anything older than 1011 gets swept, that has increased the amount of disencumbrances from the 12 to the 27.8 million. And in general fund, from the 7 to the 18.2.
Well,
so if we went with just what the departments recommended, we would only be recommending to disencumber $7 million for the general fund as opposed to the 18.2 that we're recommending now.
Well, as an example, and the question that one of my colleagues just brought up was council is in this report as well.
Right.
And yet we don't know what's comprised. I mean, we're one of those departments that, in fact, I know of one of those GCP allotments that are actually for a capital project. It's listed in the report. That's another capital project, actually, so there's a couple of them now. We don't know specifically what those funds were. And has each department actually, will they be signing off on as part of this report to accept the responsibility? I know we're ultimately the ones liable. But do we have any policy in place that they've actually signed off on what's being disencumbered?
Well,
those occurrences, that they've read the reports were given to them in a timely fashion, or is it just an automatic trigger? We hit that date, the money's moved over, and it's gone.
That's what the implementation of this policy, it's more of a blanket in terms of when the date of the encumbrance. I do want to state that that's one of the reasons why we're saying that there's going to be an additional process in place with regards to the request for reappropriation of funds.
So, but I think the process, the request for reappropriation is now new money that has to be found for something that goods or service might have already been rendered. So where I'm going to that is the responsibility in the process, the details in the process. I like the idea of the policy, but I think we need to see the actual process come back with the policy, not guidelines to be written at a later date. Because how we get from point A to point B is critically important in this. And even if there's a default that if the department was given the information but failed to act or sign off, we're going to sweep the funds, I'm fine with that. But some type of process that ensures they're going to have the information in a timely fashion.
And what I'm saying is that process took place, and if you want to go with that process, then all you're going to be able to disencumber for the general fund is $7 million as opposed to the 18.2.
And therein lies my concern. So I think, and we haven't seen what those actual funds are. So going back to this, is there a way that we can ask for a report on exactly what we're talking about? Because it's not, that detail's not, still not in here. The only one I have is the 1,000 pages here that lists all of them, and you're saying they're not all actually going to be swept.
So we can go back and provide you detail. I mean, that's what it's going to be, a several hundred page report. You know, in going through this process, is we had mentioned earlier, we kind of go through this exercise every year, sort of mid-year, and ask departments, hey, can you give up stuff? You know, they say yes, but I need to hang on to this. Part of, you know, our concern is, you know, as we look forward to 13, 14, we would really like to sort of put some money set aside in sort of our service protection account sort of for next year. We know we have a big shortfall. We can leave it up to department again and say, hey, I need this and so forth. What we are offering, you know, today is really, you know what, departments, we've heard you over the years, you've kept this stuff, you know what, we need to sort of change this, and here's the opportunity to do it. If you wholeheartedly disagree with CAO, then come to committee, come to council and say, hey, I need to hang on to it for X, Y, Z. But we believe, you know, it's time for us to kind of clean this mess up a little bit and sort of get a policy going for future years.
I agree with that. My concern is it was this committee in the budget process that allocated the funds in the first place, and then it's the CAO making the determination under policy of what's swept, and then the department's having to come back and reallocate and ask for more money out of money that's not been part of the budget for future years, and transferring then those funds that were set aside specifically out of the general fund in those prior years to a savings account. Those are all good ideas. The policy part, the bridge, the connection that I'm having a concern with is we'll never have the opportunity, and again, even if it had some trigger point in place that came back to this committee to say, here's a list of all the specific detail of the ones we're going to be sweeping, and leave it up to, and that way it ensures it's a public document as well. It's a public document that's going to be online. It's a public document that not only the departments will look at, but vendors, unions, the city family can all see exactly, instead of just line items, not knowing what is being swept, that we could either have greater liability or have a concern that we've got to at crazy times come up with vendor payments or invoice payments that we have to pay out, or it accidentally wasn't coded as a capital project or whatever the case may be. That isn't part of the budget. And it sounds like there's some easy fixes. It just needs to be ironed out, and bridging that and making it transparent so people can see what money is being swept out of the dollars that have just been sitting there for a long period of time. I support moving forward. I think it's a good idea. When you start looking through these reports, it's ridiculous. I think you made a good point. There's some here that say 2 cents and 8 cents. Mm-hmm. There's travel in here with no vendor under the police department from that was 6 or 7 years ago, $15,000, obviously never used. That makes sense. But I think that's the detail everybody should be entitled to see to make those informed decisions. Even if it were at an automatic date, they should be provided prior to that date. That's all I'm suggesting.
Well, and I certainly do agree that underlying report is something that this committee should have, and that should be a public document so that can be seen. Thank you for the clarification that this data product is not that report. That's just a working document that you used from which to do your further analysis. Yes. I gather. So I think on the policy, while it's true that the council has, through its budget process, gone through and made these appropriations, which are now being disencumbered, we made them with the expectation that those appropriations would in fact be acted upon and not hoarded in departments. And so what this process has done, I think, is given us the true accountability and transparency of bringing that aged money back into the budget stabilization fund, where it would be readily available in the event that it needs to be reappropriated, But that also puts the onus upon the departments to come back before us and justify it, rather than just keeping it on the shelf. And I think that's an important positive step forward as well, so that we can hold departments accountable for their expenditures.
Absolutely.
So I think we do need to have that report that Mr. Englander has asked for. So if that can be made available to this committee, and then is it possible to make it available by the time this gets to council?
Well,
I assume it exists. I assume it's someplace.
Well, the
readily
summaries are
available.
here in the report, so that's got to be generated from something.
yes, we do have the responses we got from the departments with their notes as far as which encumbrances they wanted to keep and which ones were they identified for disencumbering. So it's just a matter of compiling all that information.
Mr.
Okay.
Chair,
Yes,
just
Mr.
a
Isbell.
procedural question.
Mhm,
I
yeah.
have to leave, unfortunately.
Okay.
Do you need me for a vote? I would obviously vote in favor of this. I think this is the right direction to go.
If I could just make a friendly amendment to what's being recommended at a minimum for that information first to come back. And even if it moves
Sure.
forward, to see exactly what it is going to be unencumbered. Because quite frankly, we might even question more that's sitting there,
That's right.
to be honest with you. But then the other part of that is, if we've got these automatic triggers, that information be submitted with those trigger points. So we have that information readily available as well.
Ditto on that.
Well, so that I can understand, make sure that we're meeting your concerns here. Would you be comfortable with advancing this recommendation forward to council with a report back to this committee on the underlying reporting that you're talking about?
I think we've got to see, I don't know how long it'll take.
Because that's what I would like to see happen.
I know, but if we meet every week, we could do this pretty quickly. I'd like to see it come back, just because it might raise additional ideas or concerns or questions, or even possibilities to sweep even more money, quite frankly, by looking at what is the dollar, which categories and what specific types of encumbrances we're looking at. So I would just ask if it could come here, and I don't want to hold it up, so if it can come here even just by next week, that would be great, and we can move it swiftly. But I'm not trying to buy time. I would just like to see the information, because I think a lot of work has already gone into this. But this is a major policy shift, and I think it's a good one. But I just want to make sure it's all out in the open and transparent to show what we're doing.
And the impact of these disencumbrances, if it were approved by of the current one, if it was approved by council, if it was approved by council within the next month, would still be readily available to be recognized in the.
Yes, we would probably have to make some changes to the recommendations to push back some of those dates, but the intent would be to do it this fiscal year by a date certain. We can make an effort to have that data available for you to review for the next meeting. I do want to point out, though, that there's a couple other items that we're working on, the financial status report being the big one.
Yeah, next week is going to be a pretty healthy agenda. I don't know that this is going to require discussion at next week's meeting, but it would be good for us to just have the document back.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And if we could get it prior to the meeting, not at the meeting, but some time to review it as well.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Englander. I'd like to ask Mr. Rohrlich, as the spokesperson for the coalition, to come forward. Is Mr. Rohrlich speaking on behalf of the coalition? Or? Okay, whoever you have to come up, I'd like to welcome you to speak on this topic as well, not as a public commenter, but as a participant and partner in this process, because this is, I think, this disencumbrance process has been long overdue to get to this point. It's been important that we take a step back and have a comprehensive review of all of these encumbered funds, and I think we've made tremendous progress with this report in getting to that point. And I agree that, many of the folks who've looked at the budget, whether it's the budget advocates, certainly the coalition and others, have talked about the encumbrances as being a drag on our ability to get through our deficit challenges. And so we're making some progress, and I want to thank you for all of your participation as partners in that effort, and I'd like to offer you the opportunity to speak about it.
Good afternoon, Chairman Krakouria and committee. My name is David Sanders from SEIU Local 721, the Regional Director. I am sincerely proud to speak before you today, and I want to wish you all the belated well wishes for the new year. Our intention here was to actually speak on this, and we do want to speak on this, but I didn't want to make the encumbrance policy more cumbersome. So notwithstanding the objections of the CAO and some of the statements made, and in those areas where we didn't have consensus, we did want to speak on that and make some amendments or some recommendations that we think will kind of shed a little more light and a little more transparency on that. I did want to say we appreciate all the support we got from the city controller, from the CEO's office, in addition to the CLA. They were helpful in this process. The council itself, the fact that you all took consideration of what we proposed at the budget hearing, we do appreciate it. And we're just glad that it's moving forward in some directions. And again, with the exception that we want to raise today, we ask that once that's done and the reporting back, we do want this committee, the full council and the mayor, if they will, to endorse and adopt this policy. We think it's a great idea. We support, we agree with what you've stated already, and we want as much transparency as possible. I mean, if the alternative is, diminishing of services or even the loss of services, I think this absolutely is not a small amount. I think it's a substantial amount of savings here, and we want to take it. We want it to be held that serious, but we want all the money shaken out of the couch. We don't want to leave anything in there. And again, where we didn't have consensus, Mr. Rowland will speak on that, and hopefully we'll be able to move this thing expeditiously through council. And I appreciate your support.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'd like to note that last spring when we first made a presentation to you on this issue, the CAO's office has expressed a very different attitude, said in essence it can't be done. Your committee listened to us and directed that we participate in a working group with the CAO and the controller, and SEIU researchers, I should note, participated as representatives of the Coalition of LA City Unions. Your committee acted after we shared our analysis that the city could recoup $50 to $60 million simply by adopting a policy of using only current year appropriations to pay for current year services and supplies. I would note quickly in terms of Councilman Englander's concerns that one of the things we initially noticed was that city departments in aggregate did not spend much of the current year appropriations for services and supplies. My recollection is that the magnitude was something on the order of 1/3 in the last couple of years. So I'll be happy to show that to you if you have any interest in it. But that persuaded us again in the aggregate that the problem you're focused on, which is certainly, I understand your concern, might be easily allayed. So our proposal initially was that the money automatically revert after 90 days into the fiscal year, and as you've already heard and commented yourselves, one of our concerns was that there wasn't sufficient accountability or transparency with the way the city was doing business regarding prior year encumbrances then. The CAO is now proposing something close to what we wanted. It's proposing that the funds automatically revert after 1 year. We think this is a good and sensible idea. We think that departments still have the opportunity to say that they need the funds and an opportunity to reapply, and in the wisdom of this council, to get a decision. We think this is a big step in the right direction, and we think that the CAO's office has essentially met us halfway. Put it in terms of dollar and cents, when we first began, the CAO's office had done a scrub and come up with $4.8 million and said that was all there was. Today they're recommending $27.8 million in addition revert. So we commend the CAO's office for its flexibility and for its hard work in expanding upon a review we did of 4,500 purchase orders on prior year encumbrances dating back to 2000. And we'd be happy to provide you with our analysis if you have an appetite. But we also suggest that this committee and the CAO's office could go farther. We hope eventually that the Budget and Finance Committee will see the wisdom of the city moving more in the direction of New York City and even San Diego, where such unspent funds revert automatically on the first day of each new fiscal year. One of the things we looked at tangentially was how other cities do it. Every city has this phenomenon. And we found was that Los Angeles has a greater percentage of its general fund tied up with prior year encumbrances than any major city in America. We thought that was kind of stunning.
Can I interrupt you with one quick question on that? How many of those other cities engage in multiple year budgeting?
I have no idea.
Okay, because that would, I think, be an important relevant factor.
I'm not even familiar with
Anyway.
the suggestion, but I'm happy to look into it or provide you with a list of the cities if you happen to know.
Okay.
We also hope that the committee will keep an open mind about tapping this money that's going to be put in effect in a reserve fund if there is the anticipated crisis next year, and if these funds are needed next year to avoid inflicting more pain on city employees and the residents they serve. Meanwhile, I'd like to thank this committee, the CAO's office, and the Controller's office, which provided guidance and very helpful support throughout our investigation. And if I may point out just one more thing. This is just one of a number of proposals that we have made that are aimed at protecting our community in which many of our members live by preserving city services. Another very important one that the city has taken no action on could lead to neighborhood improvement and the collection of what we believe would be tens of millions of dollars from banks that own but have not properly maintained foreclosed properties. We, in association with some community groups, have visited and documented through photographs scores of these blighted properties and have turned our information over to building and safety enforcement officials. But there has been no enforcement. We have promoted a simple way to solve this problem, which building and safety attributes to a lack of enforcement personnel. We'd suggest that the housing department, which collects registration fees on foreclosed properties, make a bridge loan to building and safety, so building and safety can hire inspectors to collect these tens of millions of dollars in fines. But as far as we can tell, there's been no action on this. So you can see the cost of this inaction for yourselves. We'd like to take this opportunity to invite you to join us on a bus tour of some of these blighted properties this Thursday. It leaves from City Hall lawn at 10 o'clock. You'll be back in business by noon. Again, it'll be an opportunity to see for yourselves. We hope to see you there. Meanwhile, thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, any questions? Mr. Gretz?
Actually, I don't know if it's appropriate or inappropriate to talk more about the subject that you just raised. I don't know if I actually need to see the blighted properties. I'm very aware of the problem. The question is, I'm not aware of the process that you're outlining to actually collect the revenue on this. How would that actually work? And what
I have the idea. We have the idea.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
That's really not on the agenda. So, I mean, I think we have to discuss that only to the extent that it would be relevant to this encumbrance issue.
Okay.
We'd have to agendize it.
Councilman, I'll be happy to answer you after the...
Yeah, let's have that conversation
Yes, sir.
at some point in the near future.
Right after this meeting.
And I wanted to also thank you all for pushing forward on this, because there appeared to be some reluctance by a few when this was first presented as well. And I did hear from some others saying this couldn't be done. And I know all of us on the panel, on the committee, couldn't figure out why it couldn't even be looked at. And so I appreciate it, and the chairman's direction as well, as instructing folks to work with you and put this together. Because there's no question that there's money on the table. There's no doubt in my mind from looking at these reports that there's stale money sitting there, that they're trying to hoard, if you will, either purposely or not, or just don't want to have the time to look into it, is what I think more of it is than anything else. And so this pushes them to do that. And having a good policy in place, I think, is critically important. So with that, yeah, I would like to look at the data that you came up with as well, because perhaps we can sit down and go through it. Maybe there's other ideas that my staff or I might have in looking at that to help out as well. I think more information is always better, and so it's always nice
Happy
to
to
see
provide.
what we're dealing with. And I look forward in you looking at the detailed reports as well that CAO's office will be bringing forward as well to look at what is it exactly that we're talking about waiving, and looking at maybe there's some other opportunities and things where they're suggesting out of the 27 million. I don't know if you saw that specific report or just the summary.
Well, what happened was that we got data from the controller's office consisting of about 4,500 purchase orders that were linked to this thing. When the CAO's office made its inquiry, and when we made an analysis using some of the principles that the CAO's office outlined, one of which they didn't agree with, which was the pattern of repeated appropriations for the same type of encumbrances. Our conclusion, based on when we looked, and this number is a moving target, we looked based at the beginning of this fiscal year, and we agree, by the way, with the CAO that capital projects should be off the table. It doesn't make sense to have that money revert. But we came up with a number of $77 million that we thought was reasonable back at the beginning of the fiscal year. The CAO's office, when it sought to build on that, found out that they needed to go to a deeper level with the controller's office data so that the departments they asked could match up the specific numbers within the accounting system. I'm not sure if I'm saying it correctly, with the expenditures for their review. And so we haven't reviewed in detail their findings.
Okay, so good. It'd be great for you to see that as well. And then just on the note on the capital projects, I'm not sure that I absolutely 100% agree with you on that. I think that there could be capital projects that are done and complete and there's still money sitting there.
Absolutely.
And oftentimes that's the case. And so I don't know that we shouldn't look at capital projects. I agree that you have to continue to put money in there if the project's not done or complete. But I think we have to look at the category of capital projects completed and see if there's money left in there.
All right. I think that's an excellent idea.
So okay, so that we agree on that. Anyway, I do appreciate it and look forward to continue working together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And, I think, final comment, there aren't any quick and easy solutions to the significant deficit challenge that we still face over the next 2 years, but there are a lot of little solutions. I shouldn't say little, but smaller solutions that add up if we think a little outside of the box and think collectively. That's why this committee has made it a point of giving a platform to the Neighborhood Council Budget Advocates, to giving a platform to the coalition. Not typically people who have been in the past a voice that's heard by this committee. And I think it's important that we not just restrict ourselves to the ideas that we think of internally here, but that we are open to the kinds of positive ideas and suggestions that all of our stakeholders in this city develop that help us to achieve that goal. And when it comes to encumbrances, neighborhood councils had to disencumber their encumbered funds over a year ago. We asked neighborhoods to do it. I think it's only fitting that we ask our general managers of our departments to do it as well. So thank you all very much for your significant contribution to this effort. It's a good example of what we can do when we work together, so thank you very much. And I'm sorry, we had one card. Mr. Handel wanted to speak on item 7 as well. And as of now, that's the only card I have. So if anybody else would like to speak, fill out a card and bring it forward now before Mr. Handel finishes, because then we're going to be adjourned. Mr. Handel.
Thank you again, Jay Handel, Chair of the Budget Advocates. This is a wonderful day, quite frankly, hearing from the unions and having the unions come in as true partners to be able to dig in, as the Budget Advocates have been doing, to find additional funds that are floating around the city. Certainly, I'd like someone to tell me where they're buying their couches, because in December, we got $3 million from the police department, said he didn't have to lay anybody off, and now we got $27 million, so whoever your couch guy is, I really want to know who he is. I need a couch. Having said Having said that, yes, the neighborhood councils were the first to be swept. And I think we found some of the problems with just having a cutoff date and sweeping, with a lot of coming back to council requesting 11,000 here, 3,000 here, 4,000 here, and bids that were going to sue the city for $500,000. Having said all of that, we're still missing one piece of the part in the puzzle, I think, that we haven't talked about in looking into where the money is and how some of that money can come back into supply services and personnel for us, the constituents. And that's the council discretionary funds. You know, I received a 124-page report from the city clerk on all of the council office discretionary funds, as well as having the mayor turn his over voluntarily without having to do a PRA. And guys, you got a lot of money floating around. Last year at the budget meeting, when we found out we could only have 500 kids in a summertime program instead of 15,000 kids, we had a 5-minute auction that raised $800,000 from 4 councilmen. So somebody's got more money hiding under pillows or somewhere in discretionary funds, and I would ask that you look at this encumbrance policy, and my understanding is they do actually take your money at the end of the year, but then they give it back to you after that. So I guess what we'd really like to know is how much money the council offices are really holding on to, and how much of that money could be swept and put into services. Thank you.
So just in brief response to that, Mr. Handel, in this very report on these very disencumbrances, there's over $3 million in encumbered funds from council offices and the mayor's office that are included in this total. So that's a brief response to that. So colleagues, I want to try to reiterate where we are here. As I understood it, we were going to go ahead and approve the recommendations that are before us and advance those to council. But with Mr. Englander's friendly amendment, which I would also add one thing to, that next week we will agendize probably for noting and filing, but simply to have before us the report that details the specific encumbrances that are involved in this. And I would also ask that as part of that agenda item, we also have the coalition's report back here before us next week as well.
Let me restate it then, as it was that we hold the report until all the information. I think one of the things is, as our last speaker just pointed out, when we went through that exercise with just neighborhood councils, we ran into a slew of issues with virtually every neighborhood council, because there was no detail of what, in fact, we were giving them or looking at that we were disencumbering. So that detailed report, because that could trigger other ideas as well as, and good ideas, like I wasn't convinced that we should just not look at capital, although that could come back separately, and we can look at that on a separate item. But that the report and the process for the policy has to be with the actual report, so we'll know what we're talking about, because this policy also has the 27 million attached to it, and it was stated that even by putting it off only a week, next week, and we would have the report in sufficient time, we can still have plenty of opportunity to realize that money in this fiscal year. So I would ask that we continue the item so we have the full information in the report back prior to next week.
Mr. Kretz, do you have thoughts on that? Because that's more than a friendly amendment. That's a request for a continuance, which, you know, is a reasonable request, but it's not an amendment to the recommendations. So do you have...
Well, as long as it doesn't cause us any harm or undue delays, can we tell whether it will or not?
I think if we can have, Mr. Seha, if we could, just to confirm again,
I believe that was the discussion we had, and it was asked and answered that if we can move some of the dates around.
Yes, we could move some of the dates that are in the recommendations further back, and so long as we're able to do some action this fiscal year, we should be okay.
So all of the disencumbered funds would still be able to be realized in a timely fashion, even with that?
Yes,
okay.
I would though say that we should probably do this before the budget process gets full on the way here, so that we know how much may be available for budget balancing for next year.
It would be my intention, if we were to do this, to hear this matter next week without further discussion. If there are comments that because we have a heavy agenda next week already. So I don't want to reopen public comment and have presentations and everything. We can have comments during the committee if necessary after you've seen the information, so that we can have a further discussion about it in that context. But I wouldn't see continuing it beyond next week under any circumstances, just because of the time sensitivity.
I think, again, if I could if we have the reports in a timely fashion, we've got the opportunity to review them, and we're not getting them the day of budget on Monday,
Maybe they'll
you know,
send like-
or the Friday evening before. I mean, if we've got some time to actually look through it, do our homework, I don't see a problem with that. And it's just a matter of how quickly we can get the information. And I think we're all anxious and interested. In fact, even the working group in the committee had stated on the record earlier that they haven't seen that final report either. And I think we should before we make that decision, we should have the ability to review it.
Mr. Stern.
I was just going to ask, so with the information, will you be able to make a decision with that, or would that require bringing in the department and asking them about detail? Because we can provide the information, but will it answer your question? I mean, basically, what we can only provide is what's actually in the system. So you may see something with an encumbrance with the vendor name. You may see something without a vendor name.
Well, I'm not going to entertain having departments come in here to comment on that. They've had an opportunity to comment. We can ask questions of those departments. They're not going to come in here to testify about those disencumbrances. That we would be redoing the entire budget process, basically.
We would agree.
If we were to do that. So that's not going to happen. But I think it is appropriate, unless there's a substantive reason not to. I don't see any reason not to delay a week. If we can get the report in advance of the hearing, that would give each of us an opportunity to do whatever investigation of that we wish to, with anything that we question with any particular department. And as Mr. Handel pointed out, with our own disencumbrances as well, for that matter, and the mayor's and so forth. So I think, Mr. Kretz, is that okay with you? Then I think that'll be the unanimous action of the committee to continue the matter for next week, with the expectation that this will be a consent item, barring any questions that might still remain at the time of the hearing, in which case we can discuss it again, but I don't want to reopen public comment and do that whole thing next week, because we already have a heavy agenda. So does that make sense, Mr. Engelder? I think,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not going to foreclose discussion, obviously, among us.
I'm great with that. I don't know that requires a vote if we're just continuing it. So I'm happy with that, though. That's it.
Okay, then that's what we'll do. We'll hold this matter in committee until next week. And I would like to ask also, since the coalition representatives are still here, since we're bringing this back next week for further discussion on those details, it would be a great time for us to also have your report back on those matters that you didn't achieve consensus on, so that we can consider those at the same time and have the same sort of consideration about possible expansions as well as reductions of this.
If I could expand on that, just
sure.
If you could get that information to us prior to as well, so it's not delivered at the committee, and then that'd be terrific, fantastic. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you all very much. I really appreciate all of your good work on this. And if there's nothing else, colleagues, I believe that concludes our business, and we are adjourned.